Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining from or if you're catching the replay. And welcome to our ZTNA Table Talk series. I'm Ixa Gerard, and I'm happy to have you with us for this ongoing conversation around Zero Trust Network Access. Each month, we dive into key challenges, emerging trends, and best practices for securing modern enterprises. Before we dive in, just a few quick housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and you'll receive the replay within 24 hours. Feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A panel. If we don't get to them during the live discussion, we'll make sure to follow up with you after the session. Now let's get into today's session titled A Zero Trust Blueprint for Operational Technology System Security. I'm thrilled to be joined by three fantastic speakers today. Jason Garbis, founder and CEO at Numberline Security, Corey O'Connor, VP of Product Marketing, and Richard Miller, Sales Engineer here at Appgate. With that, let's get started. Corey, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Sixta. Let me share my screen and we'll get started here. All right, so just really quickly wanted to cover today's agenda. So the first thing, obviously, we're going to do a quick introduction on defining operational technology, talking about some of the risks and the challenges. We're then going to touch on the Zero Trust Blueprint for OT, which is the main focus for today's session. And Jason Garbis will be taking us through those materials. The third one is OT-specific ZTNA platform requirements, and then we'll close it out with some additional resources and some things to follow up on after the webinar. So let's get started by grounding ourselves in what we mean when we say operational technology or OT. And this is from NIST. They define OT as programmable systems or devices that interact with the physical environment, that detect or cause a direct change through the monitoring and/or control of devices, processes, and events. I think if you're attending today's session, you probably understand what OT is. But in simpler terms, we're referring to the systems that run the physical world. So both the hardware and the software that power everything from factory lines and oil rigs to HVAC systems and access control within your facilities and your critical infrastructure. OT environments often include industrial control systems, ICS, like SCADA or PLCs, along with building management systems, fire suppression controls, and even bad things like badge readers and cameras. And these systems are increasingly more interconnected and they're becoming more digitized, which when you think about it, they weren't designed with security in mind. And that's a big problem. And because these systems, which previously were isolated, are now more connected, the bad guys are taking advantage of that shift. So a few high-profile incidents and breaches that I just wanted to highlight here, and probably the most famous we'll start with, which is Colonial Pipeline. A few years back, this was a ransomware attack that targeted one of the major fuel pipeline providers in the United States. They supplied the majority of the East Coast of the U.S. with energy. The OT systems were shut down as a precautionary measure, but as a result, they significantly impacted fuel distribution in the East Coast of the U.S. So that was a big one. JBS Foods, I think it was the same year or the year after. This is a large meat processor that was also hit with ransomware and impacted distribution in the US, Canada, and Australia. And this attack really showed how attackers can cripple the physical production systems within manufacturing, right? And one that's a bit more tied to remote access in Florida, Oldsmar, Florida. There was a water treatment plant where a hacker remotely accessed the facility systems and attempted to increase the levels of lye within the water system, which uh, which would harm residents, right? So that's a bit more scary, a bit more tied into secure remote access. So these OT environments, there's growing risk from a security perspective, and when we look at traditional perimeter defenses, they no longer hold up, right? And that's where zero trust really comes in. And we're going to walk through this new blueprint that applies zero trust principles specifically to OT and how technologies like ZTNA and AppGate specifically can help you reduce risk, improve control, and enable secure remote operations. Before we get into the blueprint, though, I just wanted to quickly pull up the SANS 5 critical controls for OT or ICS. And while ZTNA or AppGate specifically can stretch across all five of these things, either natively, either through an integrated technology partner, or just more generically, the two that we really want to focus on here are number 2 and number 4. So number 2 is defensible architecture. And this is really the backbone of a secure OT environment, right? In the world of zero trust, it means more than just building firewalls and zones. It means enforcing granular identity-based access at every point in the network. And AppGate ZTNA can sort of take it one step further by leveraging a capability called single packet authorization or SPA, and we can eliminate any exposed ports or services from the attack surface. We can render the underlying network infrastructure invisible to unauthorized users through the use of this technology. And more critically for OT environments, we enforce access policies at layer 3, not just layer 7. And this allows it to control connections between any user, system, or device, regardless of protocol or application awareness. And that's essential in OT, where you have these legacy systems that often communicate using non-standard or proprietary protocols. So with AppGate or with ZTNA, you get a truly defensible architecture that's rooted in zero trust. It's dynamically segmented, it's policy driven, centered on identity, and again, you can make the attack surface invisible if you put a gateway, an AppGate gateway in front of the OT infrastructure. Number 4, secure remote access. So this is mission critical in OT. When you look at the number of different identities and users that are accessing your industrial systems, you've got third-party contractors and vendors, you have remote engineers, you've got a hybrid workforce. So when we look at, again, these traditional approaches like a VPN, they provide too much access at once. And when that tunnel is established, they rely on static credentials, which again, attackers love to exploit them. And with AppGate or ZTNA, we're flipping the script there, right? We're providing that context-aware, identity-centric access that's tightly scoped. It's time-bound. Access is dynamically adjusted and granted based on who the user is, what device they're using, where they're coming from, what they're authorized to do, down to the specific IP or port. And there's no persistent tunnel. There is no lateral movement. There's no visibility into the network unless it's explicitly authorized or permitted. Um, it's a remote access model that's built for OT. It's secure, scalable, purpose-built to reduce risk and ensure business continuity, which when we look at OT and critical infrastructure, I mean, that's one of the most important things, right? Not impacting operations, making sure the business is running as it should. So enabling the business, but also providing the right security and controls in place to work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason, and we're going to walk through the Zero Trust blueprint for OT.
Great. Thanks, Corey, and welcome everyone. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk about this kind of marriage or application of zero trust into this OT and OT security world and why it's important. So if we zoom out for a second and we think about zero trust as a broad security strategy, of course, that is a very large, gigantic trend in the information security industry. And we've seen over the last, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, enterprise adoption of it and application of it to their standard IT environments. And one of the challenges that I've seen after working with many enterprises over the past few years from a strategy perspective is that a lot of enterprises really struggle with applying this strategy and the architecture supported by products and platforms like AppGate. How do they turn that to an actual program and operationalize it? And that really led my team and I to create what we call the Zero Trust Blueprint. And it's a way of giving some guidance and structure to enterprises as they move through this process of deciding to adopt a strategy and taking it all the way through to the point where they're actually executing on the roadmap. They actually have zero trust policies they define in things like AppGate, SDP, and that platform and deploy them. But there's a bunch of work that has to happen between deciding to do that and actually doing that if you want your zero trust initiative to really bear fruit and deliver both security value as well as value to the business. So that really led us to create this, what we call the Zero Trust Blueprint. And go to the next slide, please. So we designed this to have 4 very clear phases with very specific and focused steps within them. And the steps build on one another. And in fact, they're also designed to be executed quickly within each organization. And the reason is to keep up the momentum and to avoid analysis paralysis that we've seen. That's one of the traps that or pitfalls, I should say, that organizations sometimes fall into. So if you go to the next slide, Corey, real quick, this is designed specifically, you can see 3 or so calendar weeks for the assessment phase, around 2 weeks for the strategy phase, and 3 weeks for the roadmap phase. And a lot of that is follow up, discussions and things like that. So it's not like it's 3 weeks of full-time effort. So this set of phases here or steps within the blueprint kind of builds on itself as it goes throughout there. And we designed this and have been applying it for enterprises for their standard enterprise IT environment. And when we kicked off this OT specific research, and thank you, AppGate for sponsoring that and for making all this happen. We looked at how do we extend this or apply this or adapt this to an OT environment. What I want to do now is talk about each of these phases and the OT specific aspects of it. So let's go to the next slide, please. So if we think about the assessment phase, so what you're doing here as an organization is you're saying, okay, what is our overall readiness to adopt zero trust and specifically now to apply it to our OT environment? The organizational readiness element looks at a few factors in your organization. What level of commitment do you have? What sort of technical or compliance constraints do you have? What sort of elements of your culture do you have to think about? And this is especially true on the OT side. What sort of business initiatives exist that can be utilized to accelerate the adoption of zero trust? And what sort of priorities does the organization have around this? So you take all those things together, and that's going to help you very quickly get a sense for how much effort you need to put into education, evangelism, internal selling versus, oh no, we have a commitment to do this. Let's actually focus on the execution. The second part of the assessment is a zero trust maturity assessment. And this is an area where we built on and extended the CISA zero trust maturity model. And when you're applying it to an OT environment, of course, you have to look specifically at slightly different sets of capabilities and slightly different maturity pathways because you're dealing with different technology and in some ways, very often a very significantly different technology environment for an OT world. Taken together, those two things give you a solid foundation and a very clear picture of your organization's strengths and weaknesses and the degree to which you have to do internal promotion, internal selling versus a heavier focus on execution. The next slide, please. As you look at the strategy, this is where you define your vision for what your zero trust environment is going to look like in 12 to 18 months. We're not looking at 10 years out. This is something that is right over the horizon that you can start to execute on and will bear fruit quickly. And then a program definition. So this is defining who are the stakeholders and what are their roles in your ongoing zero trust program. How do you operationalize that? These things, of course, build on your readiness and maturity assessment, and they get you ready for the actual roadmap phase, which is the next phase. If we look at the roadmap, then in this model, what we're doing is we're building on industry standard best practices here, but we've adapted by, first of all, taking a business asset forward perspective, looking at what elements are important to the business. And this is especially true in the OT environment, of course, because many of those systems have direct financial impact for the business. Then we decompose those into what are called their protect surfaces, the elements that need to be secured. We look at the associated set of transaction flows, and then we define the access policies, which are the elements that you want to begin enforcing in your environment. Of course, for an OT system, it's going to in many ways be very different from a standard IT environment. So it's important to have the right level of subject matter experts and a nice collaboration between the OT folks and security folks and the networking folks to make sure that there's a very clear understanding of what capabilities you have in your environment to enforce these access policies, and which ones maybe you don't. Maybe there's some gaps where you have to fill in. And that really leads us to, I think, one of the core elements of the roadmap, which is this notion of a dual roadmap. And the idea behind that is that there are actually two levels of a roadmap. And I think if you go to the next slide, Corey, we'll show a diagram here where you've got kind of your standard enterprise project management Gantt chart planning. Super important, not criticizing that at all, right? That's really important to do, but it also doesn't capture the important dependency that's pretty unique to a zero trust world, which is not just, hey, I want to onboard and enable these access policies here and here and here, but a recognition that those access policies are going to have a certain set of required capabilities, things that are provided by an identity provider or by the AppGate platform. And that there's going to be a parallel roadmap to take those capabilities where there are gaps, things that might be, I've got a capability, but it's yellow because I haven't fully operationalized it. I've got a gap that's red. I need to deploy some new technology to turn that on. And that there's a secondary or parallel roadmap for capabilities that then enables access policies. And if you go to the next slide, Corey, real quick, this is the simple example from a fictional environment where you might have something like MFA prompt for a diagnostic engineer to access a certain system. And you can see in this world, it's green, the organization is good, they can begin using it in the policy. But something like mutual TLS for network connections, that's identified as a gap in this environment. So to address that gap, the organization has decided we need to deploy some sort of ZTNA solution like AppGate that provides us with this MTLS capability. Now we have that, and we can begin to utilize the access policies that require that. So that dual roadmap is an important part of the overall roadmap planning phase. And then finally, on the execution phase, this is clearly going to be very organization specific, but it's an important part of the overall blueprint for leveraging and defining and measuring metrics that have been identified throughout the process, as well as having specific structured checkpoints as organizations move throughout this. So that is an overview of the blueprint and its application to OT environments. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that of course there are a lot of similarities to applying this to a standard enterprise IT environment, but there's enough differences that organizations have to be clear that from a process perspective, from a program perspective, and from a value perspective, security and business value, that these are going to be different programs. They're going to probably require some different technologies, or at the very least have a different set of requirements that have to be validated. And that's really gets us to the next section of the presentation here. But
Yeah.
I want to pause for a second before we do that. I know, Richard, before we get to any of your thoughts on the roadmap piece, I know you've had clearly some deep experience in the OT world.
Yeah, Jason, I think one big part of it is a common theme that we saw a lot was that vendors were allowed to build these little kingdoms inside the network. And whether that was because ownership didn't want to deal with that, or because at the time, maybe a few years back, IT was a little bit insecure about all these new devices that use potentially different protocols, not necessarily just TCP/IP, but they're using BACnet or Modbus. And I did want to point out that when we talk about protocols that are non-standard, we still need something like a BACnet IP or a Modbus IP in order to be able to create a secure transport for that protocol. So I just want to make sure that for the audience that that's super clear. But I think the realization came in when even as far back as Target. That's the example that I like to use. I know, Corey, you used some more recent examples that were probably a little bit more severe. But the realization that that needs to be at the forefront of their minds, and they need to get those cybersecurity teams involved and involved earlier, that's been a big part of the resistance. Because for the longest times, IT departments, and no offense to anyone, but they just didn't want to be involved, or they would assign a subnet where maybe the appropriate value was 4 or 5, so you could have some segmentation, but they would allow, they would assign a subnet, and then the operational technology engineering staff were left to their own devices. And, that brings up a whole different kind of subset of conversation, like the transition for voice over IP from legacy analog systems to VoIP enabled systems. They were just a different class of people that would do that. That's a good analogy I like to use. But I think it's that awareness. And something like this blueprint is a big part of creating that awareness that, yeah, there could be some devices out there that we don't even know about or think about, and we have dependencies there. So that could be critical.
Yeah, no, I think thanks for that context, Richard. I think this is something where it's certainly true on the enterprise IT side, and clearly a lot of these we can, I think, jokingly refer to them as sins of the past, right, on the OT side, and that when you're an information security leader, you got a responsibility to secure your enterprise's network, and you literally you can't do that if you don't know what's on the network, you don't know what's allowed to distinguish between authorized and unauthorized access. And if you think about all of the probably overwhelming about logs and signals and sheer noise that goes into SIM platforms that the SOC team has to go through, if you don't have a strong level of visibility of what's on the network, it makes your jobs 10 times harder than it needs to be. And I think there's been a lot of history where, certainly on the OT side, as you mentioned, Richard, and also on the IT side, where the security team hasn't had the backbone or the drive or the authority to say, no, you can't do this that way. You have to do it this way. And it's a little bit of a shift. And I really try to challenge enterprise security leaders when I talk to them as they go down this zero trust journey, to remind them that they should feel empowered to make changes and to impose more rigor on those organizations. You simply have to have a reliable process for identity life cycles, for device life cycles, and for workloads and the associated life cycles. You simply are not going to be successful at your job if you have application developers or OT engineers deploying stuff on your network and you have no visibility into what it is or what it's supposed to be doing. And that's a hard line to take, but you got to take that line, because otherwise your organization is going to have the next Target breach or the next Colonial Pipeline breach or whatever, and you're not going to be prepared to defend against it.
Yeah. And the other thing too is, I think the good news is that the vendors have started to feel that pressure. Even as recent as maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the conversation of security just did not exist at like the Realcomm event for commercial space. Those conversations just weren't being had, and now more and more they are. And the vendors themselves are starting to bring in those security controls into the devices. But how many times have you seen a device that sits in a closet in the middle of a factory for 10 or 15 years, and it has a default username and password that's widely published? So that awareness can really help to kind of quash those issues before they become exploitable or before they become a disaster, right?
Right, exactly. Or even a recognition that traditional architectures need to be revisited. I was talking to a transportation company, a large transportation company, and they basically said, yeah, if you go to one of our monitoring shacks in the middle of Oklahoma, and you're armed with a crowbar, you break in and you plug into the network jack there, you're on our enterprise network, and that's just a bad place to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So let's just quickly pivot and talk about some of the platform requirements. So I think Richard, you touched on device, right? I think there's a lot of OT security vendors out there that are doing sort of device discovery and inventory management. You've got others that are doing, network segmentation within these OT environments. But there's a big opportunity for secure access, right? And that's why we're having this conversation. So from a platform perspective within ZTNA, let's go through a couple of these critical capabilities. So first is identity and access flexibility, right? They're key. You're not always dealing with these modern federated identity providers in these OT environments. A good ZTNA solution is going to be able to work with what you have and tie access directly into your specific business workflows. Second, and this is a unique capability to AppGate, is a direct routed architecture, localized architecture. So, we talked about the SANS 5. Number two was defensible architecture. Having a direct routed architecture certainly supports that, right? It's keeping traffic local. It doesn't rely on any sort of cloud proxy or redirection. You're in full control of how data is traversing across your network. And that's critical when you're dealing with these non-routable protocols and isolated network segments. The third one is protocol and topology awareness. So your access solution has to handle more than just HTTP or SSH. It needs to understand these industrial protocols and some of these segmented network zones and how they operate. The fourth one is high availability and performance. Again, this is critical when we talk about OT and critical infrastructure. If you're running a plant or an energy grid, you can't afford downtime for security updates. You got to look for platforms that offer minimal disruption or non-disruptive upgrades and avoid introducing latency, right? Performance is also critical here. The fifth is context-aware enforcement, and this is at the heart of zero trust, right? Access decisions should be factoring in who's requesting access, what they're using, what they need, and you're not just giving them a flat network, a path to the flat network that's once they're authenticated, right? And then finally, this concept of monitor then enforce. So it's giving you the confidence to test before you're turning the key, especially in OT. You want to see the impact of these policies before you enforce them and, potentially create some sort of accidental disruption. So these are six capabilities, right? They're required, they're essential. When we think about zero trust working with your OT environment, you want to work with your environment and not against it, right? So these are just a few critical capabilities specific to OT that you should consider when you're, doing your vendor evaluation. Rich, I'm going to turn it over to you to double click on AppGate ZTNA.
Very good. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so when we think about AppGate ZTNA, and I like the universal approach that's on a lot of our in a lot of our conversations. It really needs to come from a place where you're analyzing what you have and then having the ability to kind of layer on that model on top of it, because a lot of our competitors are more of a rip and replace type model, and AppGate allows you to a certain degree to be able to layer in those controls, and then you can kind of slowly use that crawl, walk, run methodology to really deploy AppGate across an enterprise. And it happens at the conversion, but the real conversion of IT and OT. But the real problem in OT environments are fragmentation and overexposure. You've got servers, users, field devices, IoT sensors, and remote vendors all trying to access disjointed networks. And that's really at the heart of, traditionally what's been the problem. And every one of those connections is a potential attack vector. It's about that visibility aspect that you mentioned, Corey, because AppGate can cloak all of those entry points. and start to contribute right there. So in terms of the dynamic policy model, most OT networks are still built around static segmentation, if at all. Many are still flat. And that depends on the commitment level that we've been able to get from ownership or from IT leadership. Sometimes it's just non-existent. I'm sorry. Rough voice today. So, I'm talking about like VLANs and access lists and firewall rules. But even still, if that has been adopted, a lot of those approaches don't scale. And as you mentioned, Corey, they're blind to context. So AppGate flips that model. We use identity, device posture, time, location, and other criteria to dynamically control who can talk to what. So that one policy engine governs all access for users, data, data collectors, data aggregators, whether it's in IT or OT or somewhere in between. So at the physical level, AppGate layer is right on top of your existing network, as I mentioned, with usually a minimum level of effort. It's deployed as a software solution. From a policy perspective, though, as Jason mentioned, it's a foundational shift. It really is. There's no one product. There's no one easy solution. But shifting from network-based security to identity-based access is really a fundamental shift of the mind more than anything else. It's about policy. A big part of that is, obviously secure remote access. Remote access into OT, it's, traditionally from what I've seen, it's been a mess. Vendors using jump boxes, using VPNs that are very static and or are over provisioned, or vendor tunnels that stay open way too long. And sometimes holes get poked that don't get closed, which is what happened with Target. So with AppGate, we deliver least privileged time-based access, as Corey mentioned. Our appliances are fully cloaked until the point of authentication and also revocable in near real time. And that really gives you an advantage. And when I say cloaked, I mean from your outside point of presence or also internally between subnets inside your network. So whether it's a field device, a SCADA engineer, or a vendor like Honeywell or Siemens, the only thing they see is what they're allowed to see and nothing else. And that really helps to bring down the effects of lateral movement if you're potentially compromised. It limits that exposure. As far as secure transport goes, as Corey mentioned, we use MTLS in both directions so that those connections are secure. You've got that critical telemetry data from OT assets going from your central loggers or cloud, or going to central loggers or cloud analytics potentially now. And that path is often flat and unsecure. So AppGate sets up encrypted security, identity secured microtunnels that link only the allowed devices and services. And those micro segments ensure data flows only where it should, and it can't be hijacked or sniffed. So site-to-site tunnels, potentially, I like to call them site-to-site attack vectors. They can all be decommissioned and those operating costs reallocated. AppGate gives you the ability to deploy a universal approach to security and access. And so it doesn't really matter where the analytics engineer is. It doesn't matter where your buildings engineer is, if he's connected on a MiFi or a hotspot or plugged into the system in his office. We can enable dynamic access based on all of that criteria I mentioned before in real time and give them the ability to touch what they need to touch, and everything else is hidden from them. Does that make sense? Do we have any, you want to make any comments on that, Jason or Corey, or should I just keep going?
Yeah. No, thanks, Richard. That's great. And I think what's important here is that the way the AppGate system is architected, that it really works well with the kinds of incremental, non-disruptive deployments that enterprises really need. You compare it to some of the other vendor architectures, are either going to be very heavily hardware based, or in some cases, they're literally requiring you to replace your networking infrastructure because they take a very different network approach. And what the
Yeah.
AppGate platform does is it operates as a software overlay on top of the network. So it can be done very incrementally. It's completely non-disruptive. And as Corey mentioned, the fact that it doesn't require a cloud-based management plane, it doesn't require cloud-based routing, that it gives enterprises complete control over how that data is routed, where that data goes, and it also gives them the resiliency to operate in a completely offline mode. So if some bozo with a backhoe takes out your internet connection, that's a problem for the enterprise. You can't access email, et cetera, but it's not going to be a problem for your OT environment because everything continues to hum along without any external dependencies there. So it's um, this discussion between this slide and the previous slide really touches on one element of the research paper, which is the set of OT specific requirements. And we'll have a link to download the research paper shortly. But what we're doing it in the research paper is introducing the blueprint that we talked through, and then talking about some OT specific platform requirements where you can look at what do you actually need in an environment. And then clearly the AppGate solution is well thought out and is well suited toward addressing those requirements.
Yeah. And we're one of the few vendors that can accommodate older appliance-based technologies and tunnel that data from wherever the sensor is collected, like an old a Jace or an ICS that may or may not have the ability to have a client installed on it. You can tunnel that traffic securely to the newer locations, like maybe Azure IoT, or to your Rockwell, Siemens, Honeywell servers that are either aggregating data and then shipping them off to a central location, or where they're being stored locally as well. So that's a big component. When I was a customer a million years ago, that's what actually drew us in, was the ability to cover sensor networks on a subnet level. And then once I saw everything else that AppGate could do, I was kind of hooked, and now I work for AppGate. But anyway, continuing on the slide, and I know we're coming up against time pretty close. From traditionally, we don't want to over provision access, and that's just simply how it's been done. I was a firewall guy. A lot of firewall guys want to make it as simple and easy for them. They don't want to get those phone calls about, hey, I can't get this or that, and I need it right now. So they'll tend to over provision access. And the advantage here is because of the dynamic policy engine, AppGate can entitle the fine-grained controls per device or device type, but it doesn't have to extend to things that people don't even either need access to, or they should not be entitled to. So basically, a thermostat doesn't need to access the ERP system. It only needs to get what it needs to do its job. And that goes for users and devices, both an interaction that is a human authenticating and running through MFA prompts, either at the time of login or at the time of when they're trying to access a more sensitive critical asset. We can do either. And it extends to also headless clients making connections, servers between data centers, or from a device to a server as well. So it's not just limited to like single remote access as well. I want to point that out because I think that's a big differentiator as well. In terms of attack vectors, I kind of touched on it a little bit, the point-to-point tunnels that should basically not be needed anymore. But with our default deny posture and our per session tunnels, devices just can't see each other, which stops wormhole events like Salt Typhoon or ransomware dead in their tracks. The unmonitored third-party thing, I've kind of mentioned the fiefdom issue, where vendors are left to build these little shadow government segments of the network. That's probably not a good way to put it. But anyway, every user and system to the connection is logged. It's inspected. It can be integrated with the SIM for those IST security guys. And again, no more ghost tunnels, no more shadow access, no more vendor fiefdoms. And I think that's super important. Anybody that's looked at a lot of OT networks knows that there are way too many vendors that have been allowed to just build on their own. I think that's one of the biggest issues, actually, my personal opinion. And then there's sprawl. Appgate doesn't really care how many devices you have. And the benefit of scrutinizing the networks, like I said before, is that you may find dependencies or other devices present in those workflows that you weren't aware of. And the Appgate model scales horizontally. It uses rules to create access just one in time. Oh, I'm sorry. It uses rules that you create just once, is what I meant, and then they get used over and over. So it's more of an investment in that configuration time, and you don't have manual firewall rules. You don't have static segmentation that's just not dynamic. It allows you the kind of the best of those both worlds, and they're all following the principle of least privilege. So in summary, I just kind of want to say you can't secure you can't secure what you can't see, number one. So you need to do some discovery like Jason has recommended. Appgate removes that implicit trust that dynamically governs access, and also it cloaks your IoT or OT environments from both internal and external threats. That's one of the, like I said, one of the key differentiators. And it's all coming from a unified platform that actually works the way that OT needs it to work. So
Yeah.
I think that's most of what I wanted to cover.
Great. Thanks, Richard.
Well,
So just to provide a couple of takeaways here. So, when we look at zero trust for OT, security is paramount. Operational continuity is critical here. And when we look at zero trust, this little tagline that we have in the paper is OT deserves zero trust too, right? There's significant risk presented within these OT environments. You've got IT and OT that are converging. We went to an OT event not too long ago, and it was really interesting to see the attendees that were mentioning the fact that they're having to cover both IT and OT. So that convergence is starting to take place. We talked about the digitization of everything and cloud connectivity, and it's a challenge, right? And zero trust is the natural way forward. From a structured approach, Jason did a great job, at a high level outlining the blueprint for OT and the methodology behind it. And in the next slide, we'll talk about some supporting resources there. And we touched on some of the requirements. One thing that we didn't maybe dive a bit deeper on was flexibility and customization, right? Jason talked about Appgate being a network overlay. A lot of these other solutions are too rigid. And I think OT environments present a lot of, unique requirements that a vendor like Appgate can address through the flexibility and customization of our platform. So you've got these critical capabilities that you really need to have when it comes to OT. We outlined some of them in today's session, but the paper dives a bit deeper in that, which leads me to the next slide. So this webinar was really based off of the research that Jason had put together. So we have a really good, more in-depth resource if you're interested. So if you go to the resource center at appgate.com and search within the content type in white papers, it should be one of the top assets there. You can see the link here on the slide as well. But this is a great piece of content to consume and get you started. And Jason, I'll turn it over to you to come in over here.
Great, thanks, Corey, and Richard as well. This is a great discussion. As Corey mentioned, we put together this research paper, and it's available through the Appgate site. So please take a look at that. There are also a number of other OT and zero trust security related resources that we reference in the paper. In particular, I want to call out NIST created 800-82, which is their guide to OT security. And that's a really useful document. It's very readable. It talks about some of these requirements as well as mapping of their NIST cybersecurity framework to OT. You can also look at the Cloud Security Alliance. They've recently published some research on zero trust guidance for critical infrastructure. That's a really useful model as well, and it's very much complements the the blueprint structure that we talk about in this research. And if you want to talk to myself, my team, about how to put this blueprint into action in your environment, please reach out to us. You can see your email address here, or the QR code will take you to a form to request a blueprint briefing request. And we work with enterprises every day on the overall Zero Trust strategy and taking them through that blueprint step by step. So we're more than happy to engage with you. Reach out to me on LinkedIn or through one of these other vehicles. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And thank you for presenting today, and same to you, Rich. Eeksta, I think we can turn it back over to you to take any of the questions that might have come in through the chat there.
Sounds great, Corey. Yes, thank you. We did get a few questions come in during the session. The first one says, does a unified solution for IT and OT make sense? What would that look like?
So I'll go first, and I know Richard, you have some thoughts on that. So in general, what we do see is that on the IT side, there tend to be a different set of vendors focused on those environments, and they tend to utilize cloud-based control planes, cloud-routed infrastructures, and that works well for some enterprise IT environments. It doesn't work great for some enterprise IT environments, and as we talked about today, there are a lot of OT-specific aspects and OT-specific requirements that really make it difficult, I think, for an operations team to say, oh yes, we want to have this cloud dependency, and if the backhoe takes out our fiber, then our production network goes down. That's not a good risk stance to be in. So in general, what we see is that there are going to be different vendors because of these other requirements. And I guess the flip side of that, Richard, we'll probably talk about this, is that the way the Appgate solution is designed, in fact, it can apply equally well to both those environments.
Yeah, my thoughts are, I've always been a big proponent of converging those networks, IT and OT, just because of the benefits of control. And again, as I mentioned, because the Appgate infrastructure is masked or cloaked, that goes a long way to improving kind of the safety level of doing that. But it maximizes cost savings. Maybe you need to leverage some cloud provider activity, where you're aggregating data. You've got like a SkySpark, server in the cloud that helps you do analysis to make better decisions on energy use or production scale, those kinds of things. So I think it makes a lot of sense to converge it. It's just that where those convergent points meet, you want to be, a little bit extra secure. So putting in a cloaked appliance can even, like I said before, protect against lateral movement from within. Maybe a user has malicious intent, God forbid, or maybe a user is compromised unknowingly. So that can also help to account for that. So I think it makes sense. And believe me, for all of you in the audience, I hope and pray that everything that I've said is not correct, is that it's old information, it's old news, and it just changed yesterday somehow, that owners are paying attention to cybersecurity, that they are giving, the people responsible funds and allowing them to make investments in products like Appgate that will improve your cyber, profile or reduce your risk. And obviously I can't be in all those 10,000 places at once, but I don't know for sure, but I'm hoping that what I've said largely is either changing or evolving, or I'll go with just flat out wrong. I'll be happy to be wrong if more people are paying attention to their cybersecurity risk profile. So yeah, hopefully I kind of answered that.
Thank you, Rich. We do have a few other questions here. What type of cultural organizational barriers have you seen, and how to overcome them?
So for Zero Trust adoption, in many ways, it's I would say there are a couple of things. So part of it is that just overall resistance to change, especially when you have stakeholders, whether they're application stakeholders or IT stakeholders, who are comfortable with the technology and the process or the lack of process around them. And in some cases, that represents a real uphill battle for security, especially if, as a security team, you've been focused on preventing bad things from happening, even to the point where you're regarded as the Department of No internally. And one of the things I really emphasize up front working with clients is that security, information security can't just be the department of stopping bad things from happening. You have to be the department of securely enabling good things to happen. And that means you've got to get out of your comfort zone of just focus on the security things and really understand the business, the mission, the motivations and the frustrations of your counterparts on the operational side or on the business side of things. And being able to meet them more than halfway is going to open doors to uh, helping them to address their goals, overcome areas of friction, and really can help you have these really powerful, what would it mean to you if type of conversations where, hey, we know you hate this process for compliance or reporting or user authentication or whatever it is. What would it mean to you if we could eliminate that? Or what would it mean to you if we could securely enable this type of real-time data exchange with a partner or a supplier? And if you have those types of conversations, you can overcome all sorts of barriers because now you're enabling them to do their jobs better, and you're not going to have as much resistance. And that's typically the most common barrier I see.
Yeah, I agree. It's that process, having more process and less risk is always, there's a huge value in that. But people just want to get their jobs done at the same time, right?
Mhm.
And so it's my opinion that building engineers even in both industry, in commercial real estate, in industrial, they're just clamoring for this. They just don't know necessarily how to ask the right questions. There's a couple different schools, and the old guard that were more hands-on. They don't want anything to do with computers. And then there's the new guys that are introducing all these new ways to get things done, and they don't realize again that there's this inherent risk. So we had another question that I'm going to try to answer here. It's a little bit more specific, but the answer was we have many industry ZTNA best practices in place for our OT environment. Our mixed estate covers engines, solar, and BESS products. Siemens, Rockwell, Modbus, Sungrow. And what I did in the meantime is I took advantage of doing a little bit of quick research while Jason was answering. I'm not going to say exactly what these exploits are, but there are a number of them. So if those endpoints are exposed through convergence or through a lack of some type of connectivity, maybe somebody needs an internet connection and puts a MiFi modem so that they can watch TV at nighttime when the plant's slowing down. There are a number of, in what you've mentioned here, remote access, VPN issues. There are a number of inherent CVEs, so I would encourage you to go look those up. And yeah, I don't want to go too far into this, but there are a number of CVEs for almost every piece of component or every component that you've mentioned. So those
Yeah,
are things that can be, shuttered away, kept private, hide behind closed doors until you can get an upgrade in place. You can get your admin tools out and upgrade them. Maybe it's something you can do in Workbench or one of the other tool sets, or maybe it's just, a wide policy replacement. But being able to shutter those away and protect them with the cloaking technology, I think would go a long way in that endeavor. Go ahead, Jason.
yeah, I would say that you got to take a hard line on this around, there shouldn't be any of these ICS systems exposed to the public internet, full stop. There's no excuse for that.
No
And,
default gateway.
uh, and there's clearly, publicly available scan engines, whether it's Census or Shodan or other things like that, that can give you this outside view to make sure things haven't slipped through. And, for those cases where you do need to have these things remotely accessible, of course, there are mechanisms you can use the AppGate solution to do that. Even some very crude things like source IP whitelisting, it's falls far short of what we're talking about here, but even that is a million times better than having those things publicly exposed. And this just gets back to you got to have visibility into this, or you're just, walking in the dark.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have another question. We still have a little bit of time. This is a question for you, Jason, from Tarun. In the execution component of your blueprint, you mentioned about metrics and monitoring. what are some examples of the metrics?
Okay, sure. So one of the things to first of all to think about is what different audiences are you going to have for these metrics, and that's part of one of the important deliverables as part of the upfront strategy and planning parts of the Zero Trust Blueprint, because clearly, depending on what this Zero Trust program looks like in your organization, you may well have some business or financial metrics that are going to be distinct from your security or IT operational metrics. But if we kind of enumerate across all of those, we'll start with the easy ones, right? The operational security things. There's going to be some things that are going to be really important, as what percentage of admin access is covered by this new platform or requires MFA. What percent is driven by a business process such as a service desk ticket? What about my service desk load, my help desk load? Are we seeing a reduction in the percent or the number of access related help desk tickets before we change to this? How much time and effort is required in person hours for, let's say, compliance reporting every month? Are we reducing that? Those are things that are going to be really important and um, for different organizations going to be worth measuring and tracking. From a business perspective, clearly there's going to be, in some cases, some financial benefits to this if that's part of your overall model, such as, hey, we're reducing spend on our expensive MPLS and switching it over, or we're able to, across our 75 geographic locations, reduce our costs because we're retiring elements of our security stack and moving over to standard ISP internet connection instead of something custom, et cetera, et cetera. Likewise, on if there are other direct costs that you're reducing, such as outsourced IT or hourly costs for personnel, or even just internal soft dollar savings, such as, hey, we're reducing the amount of time that our 10,000 employees are spend authenticating, et cetera. So there's a wide variety of things, and it's going to be very highly dependent both on the intended audience for it, as well as the ease or difficulty of obtaining those metrics and updating them on a regular basis. That's the 30-second summary of what needs to be a much longer conversation.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the time we have for today. We're going to close it out then. Thank you to our speakers today, Jason, Richard, and Corey. Thanks for your time and for sharing your insights today. And to our audience, thank you for being part of today's ZTNA Table Talk. As a friendly reminder, the recording of today's session will be shared with you tomorrow. We highly value your feedback, so please take a moment to complete the short survey at the end of this webinar. Your feedback is instrumental in shaping the future of our ZTNA Table Talks. Thank you once again for joining us and have a wonderful day.